Alors moi, j'ai peut-être une petite question, parce que vous parlez beaucoup, enfin, vous parlez de température, avec la possibilité effectivement, de descendre la température dans les magasins de conservation, parce que le climat extérieur s'y prête. Et vous parliez de 14 degrés, descendre la température à 14 degrés pour diminuer les coûts du chauffage. Je voulais savoir ce qu'en pensaient les équipes qui travaillent dans les magasins, parce qu'effectivement, on sait très bien que plus la température est basse et plus c'est bon pour la conservation, mais il me semble que le 18 degrés, c'était un petit peu un compromis entre les gens qui doivent travailler toute la journée dans ces espaces-là. Est-ce que 14 degrés, c'est accepté par les équipes
Oui. Vous me permettrez à répondre en anglais?
Yes.
Well, it goes quicker. Oh, it's good, yes. Since about 1940, movie films have been kept at minus 20 degrees in many archives. So I don't know how to get the films in and out if no one is allowed to work at less than 16 degrees. So that's one answer. The British Film Institute has just built an archive that works at minus 5 degrees. And the reason for that is not to make people less uncomfortable, but because when you work out the projected decay rates, minus 5 degrees is good enough. For paper archives, our present answer is that you should let the temperature go down to about the annual ambient, because you can do this very cheaply. And there is more paper than movie films. So in terms of quantity, an archive has to be quite cheap to run. If the Pierrefitte archive not only abandoned its humidification, dehumidification and so on, but also abandoned its temperature control, then the lowest temperature would probably be about 9 or 10 degrees, with a consequent improvement. When you look in detail, actually the Pierrefitte, get there in a moment. The Pierrefitte temperature, which is the red trace, is actually quite high. You can see the ambient is the pale red line jumping up and down. And Pierrefitte has a very large amount of unintended heat coming in. And I think it's lighting, computers, cables, lots of sources of heat. And its average temperature, if you look at this graph, is about 20 degrees. It's actually quite warm. And it's warmer than it has probably ever been historically, because it's only since the 1950s that people have been able to keep a winter interior at a comfortable temperature. So actually one could argue that the Pierrefitte archive has wonderful control. I'm very appreciative of Bruno's capability, but it's also very warm for the paper. And our usual advice on a job like this is to say, let the temperature wander freely. Don't have any temperature control. And then in Northern Europe, you'll have to dehumidify in summer a little bit, but it's very cheap. But all of this is on the internet.
On voyait sur les photos du bâtiment du Suffolk une ouverture à travers les briques qui semblait pas très intentionnelle. Enfin, je me demandais, c'est ça le système de ventilation naturelle du bâtiment?
Well, it's an interesting question, even though I didn't understand it. This hole was made at the moment of putting in the air conditioning that was ordered by the curator, because he was worried that his archive now did not conform to the norm. And to get a license to hold documents in England, the building and also its operation has to be approved by the British Library. And what happens is the British Library is not necessarily very strict, but people think it may be, and it's easier for a curator to order air conditioning than to have a subtle dialogue with the British Library. You know this phenomenon, I'm sure. So this hole reveals the construction because the plans are not in the archive. It's a characteristic of archives. They don't have plans of themselves. So this is a hole for the air conditioning to be installed. But it gave me an opportunity to look at the structure, which is an outer leaf of brick, and then an insulating, I think it's foamed glass, and then a very massive interior wall. I should point out that the massive interior wall is quite unnecessary. And those of you who followed the sad tale of the collapse of the Cologne archive into a railway excavation, which is an interesting example of risk analysis that didn't work, that building collapsed on its own archived material, and it took a year to get it back again, to lift the bricks off it. But if one looks at the physics of heat transfer, heat movement through a wall into an archive, you find that you can do exactly the same performance with insulation. So it's odd. All the standards say one must use a high thermal inertia. It's come in all the standards, and it's just repeated again and again and again. It's just not true. And that's physics. And it's not that I'm being arrogantly assertive. It just, on the back of an envelope, you can prove that it's not so.
Je vous remercie, je n'avais pas compris la photo au départ.
You have shown, Gaël de Guichin, you have shown the result, practical result on the stability. What is on the question of cost maintenance? Did you make any calculation per cubic meter, of course, of building? Have you made any calculation if it's more expensive, less expensive, and so on? Have you compared it?
To run a hot water radiator than air conditioning. Yes, we have. Because we've actually, I've used these two example buildings because I'm here and I noticed quite by chance that the Ipswich Archive has an extraordinarily similar climate to the Pierrefitte. So I thought it would be interesting to compare the two for this audience. But to answer your question, the cost in energy of running a building where the temperature is allowed to vary freely becomes very small, something like 7 kilowatt hours per year per cubic meter. I've carefully not quoted quantities. Bruno has been brave enough to do it, but I haven't. But we have published them all because these numbers tend to sort of not signify very much at the time. But the big saving really is not in fuel cost, it's in maintenance. And the contract with the engineer to sleep with a mobile phone under his pillow so that he's always on call out, for that price you could employ a curator to do investigations on the documents. So I think that we have got into a position where we're paying unreasonably much for just running a building.
But in other type of building, not especially for archive, are there kind of numbers to have an idea how much it will reduce the cost of maintenance if there is a good investment in the building? Have you? I'm sure you have a lot of numbers on this.
Yes, I have, but I prepared this lecture rather than the one you are asking for. But the answer is that the difference is absolutely colossal, and archives are the easiest, and it's because we've been around. It's absolutely stuffed with paper. You cannot alter the climate. If you turn everything off, send everyone home, and just have guard dogs patrolling, right? The archive will remain at the same relative humidity for a year and a half. Well, it may change 5%. Well, it will, because I proved that it would. But it's bizarre that we continue to think that you have to have air conditioning. Air conditioning was invented for cinemas and shopping malls in Texas, where it gets very hot. And in Northern Europe, we have somehow just drifted along with an American initiative. That's where it all started. And all I'm saying is that it's time to think afresh, to think again, to go back to the basic physics, the basic thermodynamics. We don't know anything about the durability of paper, so we can't put that in, but at least the physics is known about heat transfer and also water vapor transfer. That's all well understood. So it baffles me. It's not just archives. We have designed storerooms for general purpose museums, which includes farm carts and electric locomotives, things like that. And they also more or less control themselves because there's enough wood and paper and cardboard in them to do the job. So my answer is it costs almost nothing.
Sorry, I have a question. You have a question. You're talking about temperature, but in numbers of countries like south of France, for example, the temperature inside could be very high if the building is not well constructed, and then there is a lot of humidity that is liberated from the archives, and the relative humidity inside the store can be very, very high, and the problem comes from this very the elevation of the temperature outside and then inside if there is not climatization.
Yes, but you can go a long way into. I don't have that much experience of the wet tropics, but in January I was looking at an archive in Malta, which is in a historic house, and the temperature there in the archive varied over the yearly cycle between 14 and 32 degrees on the higher levels. And the interesting thing about that is that it's not very hot, because people think of the Mediterranean as a hot climate, Malta particularly, but that's because those of us who live in a hot climate are so foolish as to work in the day instead of waiting for the cool night. And when you look at the average daily temperature, you'd be surprised how low it is. And this is why, if you go to the Mediterranean region, the houses are not insulated. They're heavily built. That's when thermal mass matters. You need it in the Mediterranean, because what you're trying to do is average out night and day. And therefore, this archive I was looking at had no insulation. And if it were insulated, it would show exactly the symptoms you are threatening of mold growth and so on. Because it's a subtle matter. One should not insulate in hot countries, paradoxically. In the case of the wet tropics, then you go to the opposite extreme and you make sure there is very good ventilation and no insulation, and thermal mass doesn't really matter one way or the other. And again, our experience in the tropics is that one does not get much biological attack. You get more biological trouble in buildings in Sweden than you do in the tropics. And the reason for that is the temperature difference between inside and outside. The Swedes have their houses always above the ambient temperature. In the tropics, you're living in the ambient temperature all the time. And as long as there is a uniform temperature, that's fine. And that's why you have to be very cautious about air conditioning in the tropics, because that forces you to instability where the outside water vapor content is always much higher than inside. And therefore, if the outside air is allowed to come in, it will raise the humidity. So I don't want to go on too long, it's getting late, but this actually does illustrate my point that the education of a preventive conservator, I think, should start with physics, because there you very quickly get firm numbers. And then maybe a little bit of chemistry and building science. But when it comes to the properties of materials, we're just so short of data on the properties of materials, whether and how they deteriorate, that you should then become a research scientist rather than an advisor. From the point of view of giving advice, it's the physics and the building physics that will get you a long way, and also just a few euros to live off.